outreach in office hours and communities across New York City. He has worked with the Society for the past 10 years, and during most of his career, he has represented children who have been charged with juvenile delinquency cases. Sandeep graduated from New York City University School of Law in 2006 and participated in their Juvenile Defender Clinic. He is passionate about reforming the injustice system and currently is focused on raising the age of criminal liability to 18 in New York. Also, another coordinator was Renata Lund, who is a public defender with the Legal Aid Society, also in New York City, and is a member of Southborough Defenders and has been a public defender for 10 years. She's been a mother for 5 years. In the past year, has been part of the Legal Aid Society's training unit. Also would like to thank Heather Hall. She joined the National Association for Public Defense in February of 2014. She's currently their Development and Engagement Director. Prior to this role, Heather was the Special Project Advisor for the Louisiana Public Defender Board in Baton Rouge from 2008 to 2014. From 2004 to 2008, she worked as the director of the Louisiana Justice Coalition, which is a nonprofit 16-member coalition committed to public defense reform in Louisiana. In that capacity, she built a consensus of support around the American Bar Association's 10 principles of a public defense delivery system, solicited media attention and support for her reforms, undertook a diverse public education campaign in all 64 parishes, and initiated community-oriented defense projects in select districts. She started her professional work with the ACLU of Louisiana as their legislative and education associate from 2002 to 2004. Heather received her bachelor's degree in religion and history from the University of Rochester in New York. So again, we would like to thank the Legal Aid Society and the National Association of Public Defense for their help in getting this wonderful webinar together to know your right, and I would like to turn it over to Sandeep at this time.
Sandeep, I'm going to need you to star set here.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. So first I want to thank you all for getting up so early and inviting us to speak for this wonderful group. Especially for those joining on the West Coast, extra special thank you. I know it's very early out there. So I also want to thank the group of lawyers. We have a group of lawyers from New York. That's me and my colleague Tamar Giwa. We have two colleagues from Texas who will introduce themselves, and we have a colleague from Georgia, and we will all be available to answer questions at the end of this presentation. For those who have access to a computer, we would suggest and recommend that you follow along on the free conference call software so you can see our slides. For those who don't have access, we'll do the best job possible of explaining all the information orally. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to gather and speak about these very important issues around policing and how you and your kids should deal with the police. It's inspiring for us as defenders to see mothers come together to prepare for these very traumatic and scary experiences with police. Mothers of black and brown boys are rightfully scared for their children's safety, and we hope we can give you some helpful tips and advice so your children and you can best prepare and safely navigate these situations with law enforcement. I wanted to repeat the earlier disclaimer that the advice we are giving today is the advice of us as individual lawyers from our individual jurisdictions and not the advice of Mob United. If you do have a specific legal question to your individual jurisdiction, our advice is that you contact an attorney in that jurisdiction because states, cities do have individual rules that could vary. We will have time for questions at the end of our presentation. If you're able to send your questions through the chat function on the free conference call, we recommend that so we can organize the questions as they come in. Also importantly, this call is being recorded, so we ask that you do not discuss or ask about any open cases involving you or a loved one. And if you do have a question, we ask that you keep it generalized so that nobody's confidential information is being shared over this call. Okay, let's go to the next slide. we're going to discuss a decent and wider range of information, but if you can have 2 takeaway points, these are the 2 that we really want to stress. First and foremost, any person who is talking to their child and advising them about what to do when they're with the police, your child should say, I want a lawyer. And if they're a minor, I want a lawyer and I want my parent. Those are the most important words, and those are the shield that the legal system has created to protect anybody who is being held by police. So when you're talking to your child about this, they should reflexively say, I want a lawyer, I want my parent. I want my mom, I want my lawyer. I want my mom, I want my lawyer. Those are the words that they should say and keep repeating over and over again to get police to honor those requests. The other important piece of advice that every child and mother should walk away from this is nobody should consent to a search. It is never in anyone's interest to consent to a search. We will talk about this a little bit more in depth, but the reflexive answer is I do not consent to this search. So again, the 2 rules we want you to walk away with are I want a lawyer and my parent, and I do not consent to this search. So those, if you can keep it as simple as possible when advising your children, keep those 2 tidbits in mind when talking to your children about this. Next slide. So I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to introduce themselves. So Melissa, why don't we start with you?
Okay. This is Melissa Shear, and I am a mental health public defender from Austin, Texas. And I actually also have a 17-year-old son that is on the autism spectrum.
If you are speaking and introducing yourself, press star 6 because you may be muted on the free conference call. And when you finish speaking, you can remute yourself using your mute function on your phone.
Good morning. This is Tamara Giwa. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tamara Giwa. I'm an attorney at the Legal Aid Society in New York. I work on Staten Island. I work with Zoe Mayer, one of the moms I heard on this call this morning. Hello. In Staten Island, I represent adults in criminal court, adults charged with crimes. Before this, I worked in family court in Brooklyn, and I represented parents who were charged with abusing and neglecting their children. I've worked with the Legal Aid Society since 2011, and I recently became a mom. I have a 7-month-old girl.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? This is Zanelli Gubani.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. My name is Zanelli. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. I have been practicing in Atlanta now for about 7 years doing public defender work, and before that I practiced 2 years in New Orleans, Louisiana in 2007 and 2009, also doing public defender work. The work that I mainly do now is representing adults with serious felony charges, generally like the 7 deadlies, if you will. But I'm excited to be here. Hopefully this is all very helpful for you, and thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Tiiva Bell. I am from Houston. Well, I'm currently living in Houston, Texas. I started off here as a prosecutor in Harris County, and that wasn't my calling, so I quickly left, and I am now a public defender in Harris County, Texas. I'm in the felony trial division of the Harris County Criminal District Courts, and I try serious felony cases.
We're having a little hard time hearing you, hon.
Oh, shoot. Can you hear me now?
It's a little better, yes.
Oh, let me see if I can turn the volume up more. Hello, my name is Tiiva. Is that better?
Yes.
My name is Tiiva Bell. I am in Harris County, Texas. I am in the felony trial division. Prior to moving to the felony trial division of the Public Defender's Office, I was a prosecutor in Harris County for a while, and I have been doing public defense work for now about 8 years.
Okay.
And hi again, everybody. It's Sandeep Kandari. I've been working with the Legal Aid Society as an intern in '05 and a full-time attorney since '06. Most of my career I've represented juveniles who've been arrested and charged with juvenile delinquency cases in family court. I've also represented adults in criminal court. New York is a backward state, and we start charging kids as adults at 16. So kids who are brought to family court as juvenile delinquents are under 16 when their case is brought. I've been working for the last year and a half as the Community Justice Unit Director. What we do is we go out around New York City and we conduct community trainings, know your rights trainings, and office hours outside of the courthouse, outside of the courtroom, in the communities that are disproportionately affected by violence and over-policing. And I'm very excited to be here today, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. This is Tamara Giwa again. So our conversation today, as Sandeep laid out, is about the rights of children when they interact with police, whether that be on the street, in their cars, in schools. And so I think one of the first most important questions is, what is a child? How old is a juvenile? And I actually saw this question come up in the chat function pretty early on. What is a child? So if you look at your computers, for those of you who have one in front of you, there's a chart that lays out in 4 jurisdictions, New York, California, Georgia, and Texas, the youngest age a child can be arrested, the youngest age that a child can be charged as an adult, and then the youngest age that a child will always be charged as an adult. And as Sandeep just pointed out, in New York, at 16, a child will be charged as an adult. It's pretty straightforward. The numbers are here in the chart. I just want to point out 2 things. One, I practice in New York. So in New York, we have what are called designated felonies. And what that means is that children who are 13, 14, or 15, if they're charged with these designated felonies, these specific felonies, they can be charged as adults. Those designated felonies include things like, probably the most obvious is like murder. There's kidnapping charges, there's rape charges, there's robbery charges, there's a number of charges, but if a child is charged with these specific designated felonies, they can be charged as an adult in criminal court. And then, of course, once they turn 16, they will always be charged as an adult. In Texas, just something else to point out, you can see on the chart, it says under youngest age that a child can be charged as an adult. In Texas, it says 17 without certification. And what this means, essentially, is that in Texas, a child under 17 will not be charged as an adult unless there is what's called a certification hearing. So the child appears in court, the child is then certified as an adult, and the case is transferred to criminal court. So you can see some of the distinctions among the various jurisdictions. Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay, this is Melissa Shear again from Austin, and we're going to talk a little bit about schools as our next big topic. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what should a child do if they're called into the principal's office? It kind of depends on the situation and what jurisdiction you're in, but if it's just the principal or a teacher, then the school does not have to notify a parent. The child should ask for a parent, but the child is not obligated to answer any questions. But if they don't answer questions with just a principal or a teacher, then that may be a violation of the school rules and might have some consequences that way. When it's just a principal or a teacher, then they don't have to be given any Miranda warnings. They don't have to be given a lawyer or anything like that. Now, this all changes if there is a police officer that's in the room or a police officer that is leading the questioning. So anytime there's a school resource officer, police officer, school safety officer, then everything changes and the child has a right to a lawyer and to have their parent there. So that's when they say, I want my parent, I want a lawyer. Even if it's just the principal or the teacher, you still need to ask for a parent, but you won't be entitled to have a lawyer present. So specifically in New York, a school can question a child about a disciplinary incident without the parent present. The child is under no obligation to respond and could ask to have their parent present. In contrast, the New York Police Department is required to immediately notify or make a reasonable effort to have the parent in attendance during any questioning. You should always instruct your child to request their parent when being detained by administrative or school safety personnel, which goes back to what Cindy said at the very beginning. Child needs to definitely say, I want my lawyer and I want my parent. Let's see. In Texas, I just want to differentiate from Texas. If it's school personnel that are acting alone, then they can question the child without the parent present. But again, the child should always ask for the parent. If there is a police officer or a school resource officer involved, then they ask for a lawyer also, and do not answer any questions about any incidents without a lawyer present. The same is true in California. If it's just a school official, then they can question without a parent, without a lawyer. But anytime there's an officer involved, then the child has the right to ask for their lawyer and their parent. Okay. Next slide.
This one addresses if your child has special needs, and if your child has special needs, there are certain protections that the federal government or federal laws have put in place. FERPA prohibits any school entity from sharing with their resource officers and just officers minus your consent any information as it relates to your child's special needs and mental health needs or whatever the needs may be. So in order to make sure that the officers that may have interactions with your children are aware of them, you want to get with the school because you can sign a consent for them to be able to disclose to officers, look, this is what's going on with this particular child. You also want to make sure not only that you have a relationship with the teachers and the administrators and they're aware of all of the needs of your child, you also want to make sure that if there are school resource officers, that you have a conversation with those resource officers and introduce your child and make them familiar with your child. So when they have interactions, they're not totally caught off guard with any situations that may arise, and it helps put it in context if there is a situation that comes up. Next slide.
Hi, this is Tamara again. So the next part of the conversation is going to be about police stops. When the police stop your children, what are their rights, and also sort of how to deal with that pretty terrifying encounter. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to discuss the next two slides sort of together. They cover pretty similar information. I think the most important thing you want to remember, and of course this must be a conversation that every mother here has had or is going to have with their child, but the most important thing is maintaining personal safety. Your goal always is to remind your children that they want to avoid harm coming to themselves in any encounter. They want to remain safe. They want to get out of the situation alive. And, of course, to try to remain as calm as possible. So if the police stops your child is allowed to ask the police officer, why am I being stopped? Right? They can ask questions. Why am I being stopped? If they're being held by the police officer, they can say, am I free to leave? Remind your child to ask, very short questions. One way of remembering it maybe is questions no more than 5 words. Why am I being stopped? Am I free to leave? If the police ask your child if they can search them or their property or their car, your child should politely say no. They should say, you can see on the slide on the right in big letters, I do not consent to this search. I am not agreeing to this search. I do not want to be searched, however they want to phrase it. Your child has the right to refuse to be searched. And it is especially important that they refuse to be searched if they have something that might be illegal on them, right? If they might have marijuana, if they might have something illegal on them, it is especially important that they refuse to be searched. Again, how do you refuse? I do not consent to this search. I do not agree to being searched. We're going to say this probably 50 times today because it's really important, like Sandeep said, that if you walk away with just a couple of things, that's one of them, that you remind your child to say, I do not consent to this search. They can also say, I would like an attorney present. The reason that it's so important to say I do not consent to this search is because if you do consent, if you do agree to being searched, if your child agrees to being searched, they cannot then later challenge the police officer's actions if the police officers do find something illegal in their car or on their person, if they're subsequently arrested. If they consented at the time of the search, they cannot challenge it later. So it's very important for them to say the words, I do not consent to this search. That said, it's important to remind your children to comply with police officers' demands. So, like I said in the beginning, the important thing is maintaining safety. Your children should not take any physical action to prevent being searched, right? They don't want to escalate the situation. They don't want to do anything that might lead to an arrest or might lead to harm to themselves. They want to minimize the possibility of that happening. So they should verbalize the words, I do not consent, but they should not actually resist the search of their body or their car or their property physically with their bodies. Of course, they should be polite. They should try to remain calm, try not to argue with the police officers, keep their hands where the police officers can see them. A lot of this, I think, is common sense and probably naturally a part of the conversations that you're having with your children. But don't run away from the police officers. And one of my colleagues is going to discuss this more in detail later, but it's important to remind your children to, again, try to remain calm and be alert in the situation. So they should pay attention to who's around them. Are there any other witnesses, that potentially could be useful down the line? How many police officers are there? What do they look like? What's happening? Things like that. So one other thing to point out is just that, again, your children should try to keep any conversation to a minimum. They should not put words out there that may then be used later to prosecute them. So if a police officer asks them their name, their date of birth, that kind of information they can provide, but otherwise they really should try to keep the conversation to a minimum. And again, for the 10th time, maintaining their safety is the most important thing. They want to live, to fight another day. They can call a lawyer down the line. So I think we can actually move past this slide and also past, maybe in a second past this slide, I sort of discuss both issues together.
I actually wanted to chime in real quick. This is Sandeep. Everything Tamara said is absolutely spot on, the right advice. But then there is also the practical reality that when people exercise their rights, the police often get upset. And when somebody's refusing a search, that is likely to make a police officer more upset. This is something that also should be discussed when you're preparing your children for these potential interactions. And so when we talk about, I do not consent to this search, those are sort of the words of that will set a police officer off and start thinking, oh, this person thinks they're, the man, and suddenly they're going to want to make the interaction more aggressive oftentimes. And so your child should be prepared for that. And so I have to also say that everything we say is the advice we're giving is the right legal advice to protect your child's case if it goes to court. There are also just the real-world practical considerations of what's going on in your life, what are the things that you have to get done in your day. And so, for example, I was talking to a young man, and he was riding his bike, and he was illegally stopped by a police officer, and he had a book bag on, and the police officer said, I want to search the book bag. The kid knew he had the right to refuse, and he has refused in the past, but he was late for picking up a sibling, and he decided, I will allow them to search my book bag because I have nothing in it, and I need to get out of here, and I don't need this to turn into a 45-minute, hour interaction where they may even bring me into the precinct and I might lose the next 6 hours of my day. That was not necessarily an irrational or bad decision, but it is something that everybody needs to navigate and understand the consequences of their decisions, and so the default should be, I do not consent to the search. When we're talking about book bags, cars, and property like that, you don't always know what's in it. And if there's any chance that something illegal can be discovered and you've consented to a search, that's a mess up. You've messed up. That being said, there are times where practical realities come into play and you just want to get out of that police interaction, and maybe just letting them search the property, knowing that there's nothing in there that's illegal, may be the best call. So I just always want to, acknowledge that when we exercise our rights, it looks different in the real world than it does sometimes when we just tell you what to say. Sorry, that was my 2 cents.
One of the things that you have is when you deal with a police officer, you need to be alert and you need to be aware of everything.
I'm sorry, could you speak up just a little bit or move a little closer to your phone's microphone? Thank you.
One of the things that you need to be alert and active when you interact with police officers, it can be an intense time, and there are a lot of things going on, but you need to make sure that if you're in a spot, you get a badge number. You see who the officer is. Take a visual note of who the people are around. These things come in handy when it comes to litigating your case. A lot of times you'll have situations where the officer says something happened that did not happen, and if you're just focused on the officer, sometimes you forget to look and see who's around, who was there, who saw it, where the officer was positioned, what his badge number, how many officers were there. All of those things become so important when you get into court because it allows your attorney to subpoena things like any video recordings. Most times, if you get the video recordings within the first 48 hours, they're there. But after 48 hours, it tapes over. So you want to know, this is where I was, this is around the area, and you relay that information as quickly as possible. In Harris County, one of the things we do with the additional numbers is not only do we subpoena the internal logs for that particular officer you were dealing with, but if we're aware that other officers were at the scene and you can kind of give us that information, we subpoena all of the officers, MDTs. Well, let me explain it better. What we subpoena is their radio communications, and we subpoena it between all of the officers that were present. The reason that's important is because sometimes your officer might have whispered something to somebody else and they've relayed it to another officer via their radio logs, and you get good information there. The more you're aware, the better you put yourself in the better position you have to fight against whatever case that you'll have. Next slide. This one is on filming the police. It is crucial. A lot of progress that people have made is because of the tapes that they have of officers. Yes, it's important to know where you are so your attorney can go out and subpoena any of the video footage, but we can also create our own evidence to help fight our cases. Kids are really good at using their phones. There's a way that you have to do it in order to make it safe, and we can handle it stop by stop. If it's just a consensual encounter and the officers are approaching you and your phone is already in your hands as it is with a lot of kids, hit record. You may not have time to go to Facebook Live and click on the live feature and start uploading there, but even if you hit your home button, if you have a Samsung, if you hit the center button twice, that automatically takes you to your camera. You hit record and it starts. Your child, and you don't have to put it up in the officer's face, but what you do want is to memorialize whatever that conversation was and whatever happened. We talked about earlier how you have instances where you'll tell the officer, no, you can't search me, and the officer searches you anyway. We need that information for two reasons. If he searches you after you said no, you don't get that evidence in. It has to go. So we need that in order to get that kicked. If it's an officer that you clearly told no and they searched you anyway, your no is on tape. The officer's violation of your right is on tape, and sometimes we get mad and we forget to do that last part that is crucial. I don't want the officer reprimanded. I want the officer gone. And if we file complaints and we have tapes to back up his lie, especially if he's documented in something like an official record, an offense report or a write-up, that it didn't happen the way it happened, that puts us in a position to better argue to get that officer gone. When you file complaints, at least in our office, one of the first things I request is his jacket. I want to know everybody that's complained on him, because if he has a history of doing this in the community, when he's done it to my client that's 25 to life, I get to call all of those people that said he did that to me too in order to try to get that evidence kicked. We have to go beyond just how do we defend them, but how do we get rid of the ones that are trampling over our rights? And some of the best ways to do it are recording. If you're in a car, I don't want you to pick up an evading charge. And that's when you're driving and they said you didn't pull over for them. So what I advise my clients to do, and what I advise people that we speak to in our communities to do, is grab your phone before you pull over. The first thing you do is you slow down. You put on your flashers. You turn on your phone. You put it in your seat, and you allow it to record the whole incident. You don't need to bring their awareness to the fact that this conversation is being recorded. You want that to stay as evidence. And if you're not using one of the apps that allow you to download it so they can't destroy the evidence later, you definitely want to make sure you lay your phone down, you have a clear conversation. You want to be polite. You want to be respectful. You want to be polite because that's the way that we're raising our kids. And we teach them to be polite, and we teach them to be respectful, but it also translates better when we're doing a suppression hearing, or we're doing a hearing in front of the judge, or it's presented at IAD, and your kid is polite and respectful, and this officer is out of line. It just magnifies the abuse of their power. We need this kind of evidence. I advise all kids, if you're not the driver of the car, you can go to Facebook Live. You're not under the same pressure as that driver. Go and put yourself in a position where you can memorialize exactly what's happening, because that is the best evidence we have. I can't tell you how many cases based upon videos or getting the officer's file because other people have complained, we've been able to get rid of. And I understand complaining them, but you're complaining to the officer. And if he's the one that's creating the problem for you, he's really not inclined to do much to fix it. I don't need us to wage the war sometimes out there in the street. I would like to wage it here and get them gone. Next slide.
I wanted to also, in terms of the filming the police, I wanted to also mention that in New York, at least, a lot of the police encounters are on the street, and what the police will often do so we have a group of civilians called Cop Watch who will film police encounters. They'll often arrest the people filming them by saying they're obstructing governmental administration. They got in the way while the police were trying to effectuate an arrest or something. And so one piece of advice we give when training people is to take a step back, take another step back, and go as far back as possible so that the police can't say bogusly that you were obstructing their governmental function, that you got in their way in any way. So if you're 20 feet away, you're across the street, there's no way they can say you were impeding their arrest or ability to arrest. I also want to brag for a second about the Legal Aid Society. We have a program called the Cop Accountability Project, which is gathering all the evidence and data about lawsuits against police, civilian complaints against police, and we put them all into a central database. So anytime somebody's arrested and a case is brought to criminal court or family court, we search that police officer's name and we know their record or history of disciplinary issues. And so what Tiago was saying about filing complaints, they're so important because they can help us find a track record of people who have been sued for misconduct, for planting evidence, for excessive force, and things like that. So it's really important to call attention to bad police so we can do something about it, because to date they haven't been held accountable. Okay, so this next slide we're talking about is the level of intrusions that police can have when they stop someone or encounter somebody. So this is a dense topic, and I'm not going to get into too much detail. If we have questions later about this, we're happy to answer them. And this is good. Could vary a little by jurisdiction, but it's mostly the same advice. So the thing you want to think about when a police officer is stopping someone or is questioning someone is, how much does the police officer know? So the rule is, the more a police officer knows, the more suspicion they have, the more intrusive they're allowed to be. So in New York, we have, and there's the federal Constitution, that is our baseline of rights. But individual states are allowed to create more protections than the federal government. They can't take away any federal rights, but they can add to your rights. So New York is a little bit more protective in street encounters and police encounters than other states. So we have this prominent case called People v. DeBoer that's from the 70s, and it created it basically created 4 levels of police intrusions. And all of it's framed on how much does the police officer know when questioning or stopping you. So the lowest level, level 1, is an approach to request information. And so that requires an objective, credible reason, not necessarily indicative of criminality. What that means is a cop comes up to somebody and says, yo, do you know where the party's at? You hear about anything going on? You let me know. What's good, blah, 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 just fishing for information when they're talking to people. So the normal interaction I see in New York is when a police officer sees a group of black boys, comes up and just is digging for dirt about what's going on in a local NYCHA project or something like that. Level 2 is more pointed questions. So that requires the police officer to have more specific evidence. So they need to have what's called a founded suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. So what this would be is they see a group of 5-10 people running all from one direction. So then they stop someone. They're like, what are you running from? Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you running? Because they are now asking specific pointed questions about the individual they're questioning. So this requires them to have more information. And just as I'm talking about this, what's important is this will help everybody understand when you're being confronted by the police, think about what do they know? And if they can tell you, the more they can explain about what they know, the more you can understand how much they're allowed to stop you or intrude upon you. So levels 1 and 2, you're free to leave. You can walk away, okay? However, if you run, flight in New York in and of itself isn't a reason to just stop someone, but it adds a level of greater suspicion. So if there's somebody who's running and the police thinks it's for no reason, they can ask them, why are you running? So they can go straight to a level 2. Now, if a police officer says, why are you running or where are you going from, and they run again, then the police officer might have what's called level 3. And that's an actual stop, a forcible stop, or under federal law they call this a Terry stop. And at this point, the police need reasonable suspicion that a person is involved in a crime. Okay? Now, this is when a police officer says, no, you're not free to go. So they are allowed to hold you. And this isn't an arrest. An arrest means they're allowed to hold you and process the arrest. This is allowed to hold you temporarily. A common example of a level 3 stop would be there's a 911 call. Somebody says that black male in his 20s wearing a red hoodie just stole my cell phone and is running eastbound on 42nd Street. Police officer sees somebody in a red hoodie on 43rd Street running eastbound. They pull that person over. They hold them, say, no, you're not free to go. You meet the description of someone who may have committed a crime, and they'll bring over the victim of the case to identify whether or not that is the person. That is what's called an investigative detention temporary seizure. So when the police are doing that, they can also stop and frisk. And in New York, there has been a lot of litigation about stop and frisk, and we can talk more about that. But the police need a reasonable suspicion that the person is involved in the crime, and that person has a weapon. A frisk is not for drugs. A frisk is not for any other contraband. It is for the officer's safety. So it has to be the belief that the person has a gun or the person has a knife, something that could hurt the police officer while they're temporarily detaining them. Another temporary detention could be when the police officers want to bring a person in for questioning or for a lineup, okay? So they're not free to go. They want to interrogate them, but they're not under arrest. An arrest, the highest level of detention, that's level 4, that requires them to have probable cause that a crime has occurred. Now, it's actually a bit funny. I've been doing this for 10 years, and there's not a totally precise definition of what probable cause is, but it's not the highest standard in the world. If I say, Billy over there robbed me, and I point at Billy and indicate to the police officer who Billy is, and they say, he robbed you, what do you mean? I say, he punched me and took my phone. That's enough to arrest Billy. Probable cause doesn't mean that the police have to do any thorough investigation. It doesn't mean that they have to have a high degree of certainty that the person committed a crime. They need a complaint, and they need some level of identification, and that's about it. Now, they don't even have to find the stolen property. A lot of times we have cases where there's weapons involved and the police do not recover any weapons. That doesn't mean they can't arrest you for for a case of armed robbery or something like that. They can arrest you even if you don't have the property, so long as there's a complaint made and somebody's identifying that person as committing a crime. So again, stepping back, when you're talking to your kids and you yourself may be involved in a police interaction, always think, what do they know? And then, are they allowed to hold me right now? And so just always think about that when understanding that if you ask if you're free to leave and the police officer says no, why are they saying no? Are they allowed to tell you no? Now, again, we go back to what Tamara and Tiava have said earlier. You don't necessarily want to run. You don't necessarily want to do anything that can get you hurt, but you should also be conscientious that the police may be acting above and beyond what the law allows them to do. I've been talking for a minute. Does anybody from other jurisdictions want to chime in on just sort of police stops right now before we move to the next slide? Okay, then I think we should. Was that somebody who wants to chime in? If not, we'll go to the next slide.
So this next slide, this is Anneli. This next slide really does kind of carry over from what Cindy was just talking about. And most of this is about what you should do if a police officer approaches you. I think if I need to sum it up, what I'm going to say is for most
everybody, please remember to mute if you're not speaking. Thank you.
For most jurisdictions, you want to find out why the officer is stopping you and if you're free to leave. I think that's the biggest question. And just about all of our jurisdictions, it's okay for an officer to walk up to you and to inquire and to ask, basic information. What's your name? Maybe an age, maybe an address. Do you have to answer those questions? Well, in New York, you're not required to carry an ID. If an officer asks you those questions, then certainly you have a right to answer those basic questions, but you don't have to if you're not under arrest or if you're not being detained or investigated for any extended period of time. In New York, you don't have to carry an ID, but one of the things that the New York attorneys want to make sure you know is that if you don't produce an ID, the officers could detain you briefly and try to do a background check or check to make sure you don't have any warrants. And they also want to bring to light that there's a potential for them taking you to the precinct to do further investigations if you don't give them just that kind of basic information. But you're not required to have an ID in Texas. in New York. And then when you're in Texas, outright refusing to identify yourself is also something that could get you arrested. So same recommendation, if you are being asked to identify yourself, please comply. Do so politely. But let me say this, this is for any jurisdiction. If a police officer asks you a question and you choose to answer that question, tell the truth. I think every single jurisdiction has some kind of law that relates to providing false information to a law enforcement officer, giving a false name, or something to that effect. So we always say you have these rights to remain silent and not to talk, and we always say use them, right? And if you're not going to use them, then don't lie. Otherwise, that could lead to an arrest in a legal basis for you being arrested. In Georgia, and I'm a Georgia attorney, but one thing I would say about in Georgia, you are not required to provide any information to an officer unless you're driving a car. So if you're stopped on the street, an officer approaches you, if you're not under arrest, if you're not being detained for any kind of investigative stop or anything like that, then you don't have to tell him anything. You can walk away, and you should. Now, if you are driving a vehicle, there are some requirements. And if you are driving a car, you are required to have an identification, proof of insurance, and registration. So if you have a son or daughter in Georgia and they are driving a vehicle, make sure that they always have those things, because at least in Georgia, any traffic minor offense could be the basis for an arrest. So to avoid all of that, just make sure once you get in that vehicle, you have what you need to have. Now, I guess the last thing I'll say about all of that is just be polite. You know, always be polite to officers. It often feels very dirty, especially when you feel like your rights are being violated. They're approaching you for no reason. But the reality is you are not going to win a fight with a police officer on the street. So, you know, just keep that in mind. Pay attention to your surroundings and gather as much information as possible. Okay. Does anybody have, I think that's it for now, unless anyone has any specific questions or wants to follow up.
This is Melissa from Texas, and I just wanted to add to this. If you're hearing,
I'm sorry, Melissa. Before you, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Melissa.
If you are in Texas and someone stops your son and they have asked for his name or ID, be sure to let your son know not to get an attitude and not to get smart, and to give the real name. There are many issues where people will get arrested because they'll say, oh, well, I gave my middle name. And that's not the name that the officer is going to pull up when they run their checks of you. If there's something that's inconsistent about what you're saying to what they have in their computer, then you're going to get arrested for failure to ID. So be sure to give the name that's on your ID. That's all I wanted to add about that.
Okay, thank you all very much. This has been very informative, and I know that we have some moms on the call who have questions. I would just like to set it up and let you know that we want to keep all calls to about 45 seconds to 1 minute. And we want to make sure that, yes,
Hey,
Trisha?
Otisa, we still have car stops. Can you see the slideshow?
I can see it. I thought they said they were finished already with questions.
Oh, no. This is Melissa Shear again. I've got the slide on car stop. And we can go to the next one. So, can my child keep his hands on the steering wheel and direct officers to his license and registration? Okay, so this is important. You can do that, but if you direct the officer to get something out of your car, then that could be interpreted as consenting to a search. So what you're going to want to do is keep your hands where the officer can see them and tell them, my license and registration is wherever. It's in my glove box or it's in my wallet. And then ask them, would you like me to get it? So don't do anything physically. Don't move anywhere without letting them know and asking their permission first, so that they don't have the any thought that you might be trying to pull out a gun or something like that. Because if that thought comes into their mind, things get dangerous. So generally we don't recommend that you have officers reach into your car, because if they do, then you're increasing the chance that the police officer will make you get out of the car. And if you tell the officer, here's my license and registration is here, go get it yourself, then that could be interpreted as consenting to a search, which you also don't want to do. So if the officers request the driver's license and registration, your child should tell the officer where it is and ask the officer, do you want me to get it out? And wait for them to respond. California, you should keep your hands on the steering wheel unless the officer asks you to step outside the vehicle. do not reach anywhere inside the car, and if you have registration and license, instruct the officer where it is located, and the officer will direct the action.
Sure.
So the next slide. Can the police search the driver when they stop a car for a traffic ticket? No. So if you're being pulled over for speeding, the police cannot search you just for a traffic ticket. They have to have a reasonable cause to believe that there's criminal activity, like if they smell weed or if they notice something that seems like something else that's criminal is going on. Let's see. So traffic stops often escalate to a full search and confrontation. So once the police are at your window, they will say they observed different kinds of suspicious behavior. They'll say they smelled marijuana or they saw someone reaching under a seat to hide something. Maintaining your safety is always the most important consideration. And some other information is that officers are not allowed to search you on a routine traffic stop. There is no question that the police officer is not authorized to conduct a search every time he stops a motorist for speeding. Even though the rules of criminal law are generally applicable to traffic violations, the legislature never intended to authorize a search of a traffic offender unless, when the vehicle is stopped, there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that the officer is in danger or that there's probable cause. So that just goes along with the being polite thing, because if they roll their window down, they're talking to the police officer, and they start behaving in a manner that seems aggressive or behaving in a manner that seems like they're going to try to get away, that immediately gives the officer probable cause to search them and to arrest them. So just have to be calm, be still, and don't invite a search by telling the officers to reach into your car or by giving them additional information that they could manipulate. Next slide.
So we were asked, if your rights are being violated, should you say something right then or be quiet and fight it later? This is a deeper philosophical question, and there's no right answer to this. And so it really kind of depends on your family and your own priorities and your child's priorities, or what are the most important things to exercise. So rights are an interesting thing, and people have shed blood, sweat, and tears to fight for rights. At the same time, me personally, when I give advice, my advice is always oriented towards preserving the person's physical safety and well-being as the first and foremost priority. But that's my philosophy, because I don't want any more black and brown children shot by police. That is my priority. However, if whoever can see the slideshow, that's a person who is exercising her right in a very scary situation, and there's nothing wrong with what she's doing. And this is where the simple answer is it's complicated. And so when I say preserving your physical safety is the highest priority, that's my opinion. And then my other opinion is avoiding an arrest is the second highest priority. So I think you have to do a balancing act between your personal principles and the particular situation more than actually a legal analysis. So if the person's foremost goal is to protect and exercise their rights, then a person being stopped by the police should tell the police that what right they believe is being violated, either their right to privacy, the right to a lawyer, the right to a parent, whatever right you think is being trampled by the police, you should go ahead and say that if that's the most important priority. Even if you do tell the police officer that you believe they're violating a right, that will almost never deter them from continuing to violate that right. Everybody should know that even exercising or trying to vocalize a right doesn't mean that a police officer won't still continue violating it. So, for example, let's go back to the bag search example I was saying earlier. You have the right to say, no matter what's in your bag, I refuse to let you search my bag. I do not consent, because you believe your right to privacy is the most important thing. However, if you believe your personal safety and avoiding an arrest is the most important thing, you may decide to say, yes, I allow you to search the bag, so the police officer feels happy and will think you're being compliant. We're in a weird time right now with police. With talking to more police, and since some of the more public police shootings in Dallas and in New York, police officers are really scared. Despite all of their power and authority and weapons, they are really walking around scared, and especially scared of black men. And they are scared of black men with guns, and there's this hypervigilance that happens and this paranoia that happens. And so it's perverted, but it is now our job. It is black men's job. It is our families' jobs to de-escalate the situation and to make the police officer feel safe, to make the police officer feel like there is no impending threat to their physical safety. Because that's what I've seen happens is if you see some of these shootings, it's a police officer acting very scared. And so if there's anything we can do to de-escalate it, that will increase our chances of not having more blood shed. Again, this is a matter of principle and philosophy. It's not about legal analysis. And what often happens is if somebody's too vocal about exercising their rights, in a police officer's opinion, the police officer will then arrest them for something bogus like disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, obstructing governmental administration. These are the types of arrests that are pretty subjective, and so it's hard to disprove, and it's really a police officer feeling like you pissed him or her off. I wanted to see if anybody else from the other jurisdictions wanted to give their own philosophies. There's one line, I actually don't know who wrote it, it's one of our Texas colleagues, but it says, live now, litigate later, and I think that's a very powerful statement. But, if there's anything anybody wants to add from the other jurisdictions before we change the next slide, chime in. Otherwise, we could go to the next slide.
I will chime in just briefly because I know we're running out of time. As it relates to what you do in the moment, as you're dealing with the officer there at the scene is doing all the wrong things. You keep your rights. You exercise them. When they ask for a search, the answer to that is no. It's a polite no. The reason I suggest you record everything now is sometimes the best fight is making sure that officer is no longer there. And if you exercise your rights and you don't consent to the search and he stops you and he harasses you and he holds you up for 15 minutes and he had nothing on you, instead of being mad about it, after he holds you up for 15 minutes because you stuck to your rights, you file a complaint, and you continue to file a complaint. Here in Harris County, we've gotten to the point where now if you get more than 3 complaints on any particular officer, ID has to launch an investigation, and it automatically goes as a flag in their file. It helps us here because if I have flags in your file, those flags come with people that I get to question later. We have to get rid of them, and that means we file a complaint after exercising our rights, or that's what I suggest, that if you're there and you don't want the search, you say no. And when he searches you anyway, that just gives me ammunition to try to get him gone. We got to take the high road in order to get the road kind of clear for our kids in the future. So I would suggest that you exercise your rights, but you don't forget the most critical part, and that is to complain later, to make a record so we can get rid of the officers that need not be there. And for the ones that are walking around, they're a little scared, I need you to complain so we know the ones that are scared and we can get rid of them. Because if you're that scared, you should have a different line of work. Oh, that's from Texas. I'm done.
I fully agree. And I just want to also make sure everyone knows I'm in no way a police apologist. I think the state of affairs is abominable and unacceptable, and we should continue demanding change. And Tiava's advice is really spot on for how we can actually get some real reform and how we're being policed right now and how black men are being policed. But I just wanted to just have a practical conversation because I am in no way a police apologist. I really think we have to demand for change.
This is Nelly, and I do want to say one thing on the issue of consenting to search. First of all, the law gives the police a lot of ways around your consent. So I always encourage people to maintain your rights. Don't help them because don't help them. The other thing is you never know what they're looking for. And so that's another practical conversation that you got to have with your children because, small example, I've had situations where there were 3 or 4 people who participated in a crime, and let's just say a robbery, and they got away from the scene, but the phone call was a description of some clothing that they were wearing. And a gentleman was stopped. He did not have any of the property from the robbery on him, but what he did have in his bag was a shirt matching the description of the clothing that was called in. Now, he didn't know that what they were looking for was the search. He thought he was smart because he said, well, I don't have any of the person's property on me, so yeah, search me. And that resulted in an arrest. So sometimes you just don't know what they're looking for if they ask you to search, and it doesn't always have to be a weapon or drugs or, something like that. So just be careful about giving them an opportunity to violate your rights. The last thing I'm going to say, I guess, about that is just also have a practical conversation with the kids about who they hang around, because that is a huge part of the problem that we get as well. Some might say where 2 or 3 black men are gathered, the police are not far behind, and they need to know that you got to be careful about the company that you keep and the kind of attention that you draw to yourself. So if you just want to avoid a bad situation generally with the police, then be mindful of those sorts of things.
Hi, this is Tamara. The question on this slide, it relates to everything we've just been talking about, but the question is, can the police arrest my son for doing something they believe is disrespectful? And there's sort of a nice graphic on the slide that captures things that police can legally do and things that police actually do. So the answer to this question, can the police arrest my son for doing something disrespectful? The answer in theory is no, right? Being disrespectful in and of itself, thankfully, is not a crime. But the reality is quite different, right? The police are skilled at turning any kind of act of disrespect into a crime. So the real answer here is that the police can and the police will and the police do arrest children, people, for disrespect. The case after the arrest may end up not being prosecuted. The case could get dismissed, but your child could be arrested for disrespecting a police officer. So what do I mean by that? For example, in New York, your child could be charged with harassment. They could be charged with disorderly conduct. And they could be charged with something called obstruction of governmental administration. Basically, it's the idea that your child would be interfering with some kind of police activity or police function. In Texas, your child could be charged with interference with public duties. Again, it's the same idea, interfering with the process or the function of a police officer. In California, your child, for example, could be charged if the statement that they make to the police officer is a threat to commit some kind of crime resulting in death or injury. So a threat. They could be charged with obstructing justice. They could be charged with resisting arrest. In Georgia, for example, your child could be charged with criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, obstruction of a law enforcement officer, or even something called terroristic threats. So those are just a few of the many, many things that your child could be charged with for being disrespectful to a police officer. So the bottom line really, as we've said so many times today, is reminding your children in their encounters with police officers to behave respectfully, politely, calmly, because we have to remember ultimately that there is a huge difference between what police can legally do and what they will actually do. I think we can move on to the next slide.
This is Tiava. This slide deals with questioning of minors. In New York, the ages, if they're under 16, then the way it's written there is they need to be given an attorney as soon as practically possible. under this rule, when the child gets in, a lot of times the person they ask for is their parent. The child needs to be aware that the person they need to be asking for is an attorney and their parent. They will be allowed to question, or when they contact the parent can invoke the child's right to remain silent by saying, do not ask my child any questions. And the questions shall cease at that point. But the child needs to know that if they have these interactions and they're brought down to the station, ask for an attorney. That needs to be something that's drilled in them. They love their mom. That's who they're going to want to call to be safe. Ask for an attorney immediately, because the way the law is written, the questions have to cease at that point. So to make it all stop, they need to know, ask for an attorney. In Texas, they're not as strict as in New York, where they allow you to, over the phone, invoke your right to remain silent for your child. But your child needs to know in Texas, when an officer detains you and begins to ask you questions, ask for your attorney. I tell my kids the same way I tell, everybody else. When an officer is questioned, although they're being questioned by other officers, their IAD rep has to be there. Their attorney is there. I'm asking you to make sure that they know to ask for an attorney, number one, and their parent. The parent in Texas is supposed to be called as soon as practically possible. California has the tightest law as it relates to that. In California, they were supposed to be given a call within the first hour, 2 calls within the first hour to allow for their parents to be contacted. Please make sure that no matter what the jurisdiction, the first thing your child says is, I want an attorney. They can spin it any way they want to, but it has to be certain. I don't want to answer any questions. I won't answer any questions without my attorney present. Another thing that the parents need to be aware of is, an officer will get you to the scene and say, oh, why don't you talk to the child for us, or sit with your child and help us clear up the situation, because we don't want that. This is a misunderstanding. It's a trick. It happens all the time. What you need to do at that point is remember, if they need the answers, or your child will have already been arrested. You need to invoke your right and get an attorney for your child as soon as possible, or make them aware, my child is not answering any questions, even to clear this up, because I know you want to be helpful, without an attorney. It's just, if one thing as it relates to all questions that you take away is, we do not answer questions in police stations or by the police without an attorney present. And we're just exercising the same right that they implore for themselves. Next slide.
So this last slide basically continues to establish what we've been establishing, which is always ask for a lawyer, always ask for a lawyer, always ask for a lawyer. Generally, what I will tell you is that in Georgia, adults and children both have the same right to remain silent. So if you are taken into custody, you should be given Miranda before any statements are taken. If it is a child, if it is a minor, you must know that the police are not required to contact a parent before they question a child. So in Georgia, you can talk to a child with or without their parent. Now, there is some law that says that it is advised that they should contact the parent once they detain a juvenile, but it's not a requirement. So what you have to tell your child, especially in a state like Georgia, is tell them they have to ask. And once they invoke that right, once they ask for a parent, or once they ask for an adult, then the questioning should stop. So to some regard, with a minor, at least in Georgia, the burden is on the child to make sure they're the one who says, let me call my parent right now and get me a lawyer. And then the questioning should stop, but the police are not required to do that. In California, again, they have some of the more protective laws for minors in this area, but within 30 minutes of being taken into custody, an officer will read the juvenile their Miranda rights before they continue to question them. But again, you can always choose not to be questioned at all, and you should always ask for your lawyer. You should also always ask for a parent. Other thing that's important in a place like California is just that if you are not comfortable speaking English, if there's a language barrier, then law enforcement should be able to read those Miranda rights to you in your own language. And I know at least out there, in most jurisdictions, at least there's a translation for Spanish Miranda rights. So that's something that comes up in California a lot. And so those attorneys wanted you to know about that. But in New York, those attorneys are really asking you to understand something that Kiaiva just mentioned, and basically that is the police will use you to talk to your child and get the information that they need if they can. So don't show up and try to be helpful, and don't encourage your child to go in there and talk and tell the truth and explain their side. We will fight it out in court. So always remember, ask for a parent, ask for a lawyer. Your child does have rights to Miranda if they're being questioned about any crime. But the best practice is just to not speak. Don't say anything other than, I want a lawyer, I want my parent. And that's it, I think.
Just briefly, another thing you need to be aware of as parents is sometimes they'll put them in the jail situation and allow them to use a jail phone. Many times those conversations are recorded, so when they're in custody, it's not the appropriate time to say, baby, tell me what happened, and explain everything, because that evidence that they were telling you will be later used against them, and I've had those tapes pop up in some of my cases. So over the phone at the jail is not the appropriate time for you to have a conversation, because they will record those conversations, and they will be used as evidence against your child.
I'll also say that goes for when you go to the precinct and your child's at the precinct to be questioned. Same thing. Those conversations can be recorded. So all you say is, tell your child, we're not going to be talking about the case. We're not talking about anything that happened. Are you okay? Have they hurt you? And beyond that, don't talk about the facts of the case. Just try to get them out of there. The truth is not your friend. Asking for a lawyer is your friend.
And one last thing, parents, this is more for parents. You don't fall prey to answering questions for the police either, because sometimes they will come to you and ask you questions and suggest that they are trying to help clear your child, or your child's name came up in something. So, why don't you tell me where he was? Or, tell me if he has this particular piece of clothing. Or, you see this photograph I have? I mean, who is this? Do you think this looks like your child? And you don't know that this is a photograph that's a still shot from a surveillance camera at a crime scene. So just be mindful that most of the times the intentions are not genuine. The intention is to prosecute and to gain more information to prosecute. And so even as a parent, you have to be careful not to give the police officers information about your child that they can then take and use, to continue to investigate and prosecute your child. So just be mindful about that. While we're being their champions, we don't want to unintentionally provide law enforcement with some information that might be harmful for them. So ask for a lawyer, or just tell them you'll talk to them once you get in a lawyer, or just don't say anything at all.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been extremely enlightening, and I know you've all been also answering questions in our chat. So if there are any very, very quick questions that can be asked over the phone that were not handled in chat, if your questions were answered at all in chat, we ask that you not elaborate on those questions. But if there's a new question that can be condensed to maybe 45 seconds, you can unmute yourself, and that's *6, and ask your question briefly. Because we have just a short period of time, I might interrupt if you go very long. So thank you so much for being mindful of other mob sisters who may want to ask questions. So please ask your questions now.
*6.
Good morning. My name is Kimberly. I'm calling out of Ashburn, Virginia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My question in reference to asking for the attorney, if you're a child and you ask for an attorney, or if you're an adult and you ask for the attorney, are you given the privilege to call an attorney, or are they going to assign a public defender? I mean, what I mean, you're there, so what would happen? Because 9 times out of 10, many people won't have an attorney immediately in their Rolodex.
If you have not been arrested and you ask for attorney, basically the function of asking for attorney is because the law says if you've invoked your right to counsel, they can't ask any more questions without your attorney present. So if you haven't been arrested, they're going to let you go because they can't ask any more questions. If you have been arrested, they're going to go ahead and process you in. But that effectively ends the questioning unless you restart the questioning by saying, yeah, I want to answer questions later, but it just cuts the questions off and it makes it quicker for you to either leave or they'll start to process you in.
I don't know of any jurisdictions. There might exist, but almost nowhere do they actually allow you to do they actually give you a public defender in the precinct. So when you're in police custody, until you go to the courthouse, that's when you get the public defender assigned to you. So Tiava's answer is right. When you're just being held, it's just a shield to stop them from questioning you any further.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please. If you're trying to speak, you may need to press *6 to unmute yourself.
Good morning. This is Linnell Williams-Halsey. I'm calling from Maryland. I have a son that's autistic, and he doesn't always understand questions that are being asked of him. So if he asks for an attorney or he asks for his mom and they don't respond in the way that he understands, what should my next steps be once I get to him?
If he asks for an attorney, at that point the question should cease. And that's the reason we tell him to ask for the attorney first, because the law says you can't continue to ask questions on the subject or at all after the right for an attorney has been invoked. The reason that's so important is because if you get there and you find out that he asked for an attorney and they continue to ask him questions, that allows you to move or give your attorney the information to move to have anything that they can't use things that they gained after he's asked for an attorney. So that kind of helps ensure them in that respect. And that also goes back to the slide we talked about earlier. The local people that are in the area, they should be apprised of, this is the situation. These are his needs. So if you do have a situation, they're familiar with your child. So if you do want to introduce them to local law enforcement and have them up there so they kind of get to know them. Sometimes when they know your children, they treat your children differently and better, meaning they know that this is a mama that's going to be on it, and if it's a problem, she will make sure that I pay for the problem, and if not, we're good. And the school also needs to be aware of him, and they need to know that you're going to play a very vital role in his education, and you're going to be up there quite a bit, and that will dictate how they handle him.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. If you're not currently speaking, make sure you mute your phone. All phones should be muted except the next question. Press *6 and answer question.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, ask your question, please.
Yes, I have two sons, 19 and 16, here in Georgia, and this kind of goes back to where they were saying in the state of Georgia you don't have to provide information if you're not in a vehicle. But my son and his cousins, they're like between 15 and 16, they like to take off on their bike and stuff like that. What if something happens and they're pulled over or the police stops them? Do they have to answer questions then, or is it kind of like the same protocol for that? If they're on bikes riding around?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, we can hear you.
So the short answer is no. Being on a bicycle is very similar to being, walking on the streets. Now, if they're on the highway, then you have traffic laws that apply. If you are moving a vehicle on the public highways, then there are certain requirements. You do need to have ID or some sort of, proof of your legal reasons for being where you are, right? And most of that is about safety. We can't have people driving around in cars without identification or insurance or those sorts of things. But riding a bicycle is generally not considered the same thing. One thing I would say is with bicycle laws, the bicycle laws in Georgia are a little bit funky. So you do need to be aware that depending on where they are riding, they may or may not be pulled over. There in Georgia, in most places, you are not allowed to ride a bicycle on a sidewalk. So if you are riding, in a municipal area, you're supposed to ride on the road and obey various traffic laws. So what I would encourage you to do is to look up the Georgia bike laws, so that because there are a specific set of laws related to riding not a motor bicycle, but just like a regular bicycle in Georgia. I would say look those up and tell your sons and their cousins to make sure they know that they are complying with that. Otherwise, if they get stopped and they're not complying with those, then it does turn into something different, and the officer could say, well, I've got probable cause to write this minor citation because you were riding unlawfully, and then at that point, they should be asking if they're free to leave, and if they're not, they should not be talking anymore. So just look up those bike laws and make sure that your sons are complying with those. Okay. So that's the first thing I would say, because if the officers can argue some legal basis for the stop, then it creates another problem. But if you are not under arrest in Georgia, period, if you're not being arrested or detained for any investigation, your first question should always be, am I free to leave? If you are, do it. If you're not, be quiet. Right. Polite.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more super quick question. If you have one last question, this will be our absolute last question. Hit star 6 to ask your question now.
Hello, this is Rachel Copeland from New York. At what age would you recommend a mother to get a legal ID for her son to carry on him at all times?
In New York, I would recommend age 7 because that's the age when a child is arrestable.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm sorry to have to give that kind of advice.
Wow.
So a 7-year-old needs to go to school with an ID on him?
I mean, honestly, I've been in family court. I worked in family court for 8-9 years, and the youngest case I ever got was 8. I never got a 7-year-old. And truth is, for kids that little, the arrests are usually school related, but you never know. And I would say if you can get them an ID, it's a backwards policy, but at 7 or 8 they can get arrested, and so just to be safe. But realistically, once they're 11, 12, studies show that black boys are aged in police officers' minds. When they see a 10, 11-year-old black boy, they're seeing a 14, 15-year-old. So at least by 10 or 11, when there's a higher risk that police interactions can increase.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was very sobering. Thank you. And now we will close out the call. Thank you all for your call, for your questions.
So I just want to take a moment. This is Sapelsha to thank you all so much for this wonderful presentation. This information is invaluable. Much of it is disturbing, but I feel more empowered as a mom of a black son to know what to do in these situations. So just thank you for that. Also wanted to say I have a newfound respect for the West Coast moms. I'm usually in New York. I'm in Vegas this week, and the struggle is real from the West Coast. So I applaud you all once again who call in every morning, every Saturday, and please join us again next Saturday. Just a couple of takeaways I got from the call. We should tell our children to say, I want a lawyer, I want my parents, I do not consent to a search, and to ask questions like, why am I being stopped, and am I free to leave? And finally, the big takeaway that I heard is live now and litigate later, because that's what we all want for our sons, for them to be safe and live to fight another day. It's not a fair fight. It's not a struggle we should have to embark upon, but we do, and that's why we're here as Mob United. So thank you all so very much. We really, really appreciate it. We're going to make this information available, I believe, so we'll let you know how to find it after the call. And we look forward to partnering with you all again. This is really wonderful, so thank you.
Yeah, and any further questions? Any further questions, you can send them to education@mobunited.org.
Yes, so thank you, Tanya, also for organizing this.
Great job. Thank you all so much for joining us.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful week.
Thank you, and you too.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
you so much. Bye-bye.